There is a white dome on the deck of every Arleigh Burke class destroyer in the United States Navy. It looks like R2-D2 bolted to the rail, roughly the size of a compact car. Beneath that dome sits a 6-barreled 20mm Gatling cannon capable of firing 4,500 rounds per minute. And when a threat appears on radar, a drone, an anti-ship missile, an incoming boat, that dome sits completely still. The ship's long-range missiles are already airborne. The medium-range systems have already taken their shots, and that white dome has not moved. The threat is at 12 miles, then 8, then 5. The dome does not move. The threat crosses 3 miles, 2 miles, and still nothing. And then, somewhere just inside 1,500 yards, the dome spins up, the barrels rotate, and the gun opens fire. The question is not why it fires. The question is why it waited that long. This ship carries SM-2 interceptors with a range of 90 miles. It carries SM-6 missiles that can reach beyond 70 miles. It has the Aegis combat system tracking every contact in the sky. So why does its final layer of defense hold fire until the threat is almost close enough to touch? That is the paradox, and it is not an accident. It is a design choice, one that reveals something important about how naval defense actually works, and what it costs when it doesn't. Here is where this goes. The short range of the Phalanx is not the weakness. It is the price of a fire control method that only functions inside a very tight window. Understanding why that window exists means walking through the physics, the economics, and the math of a saturating drone raid. And at the end of that walk, the real question is not whether the gun works. It is whether the captain still has something left when the second wave arrives. The Phalanx closest in weapon system, formerly designated Block 1B in its current production version, has been part of the US Navy's surface warfare toolkit since 1980. The original design came out of the late 1960s, driven by one specific threat, the Soviet anti-ship missile. The Soviet Navy had invested heavily in sea-skimming cruise missiles, weapons that flew low, fast, and late, designed to defeat radar tracking by hugging the water's surface until they were already inside an adversary's defensive envelope. American planners needed something that could engage those missiles at extremely close range when everything else had failed. The result was a fully autonomous, radar-controlled gun system that could acquire, track, and engage a target in fractions of a second without waiting for a human to press a trigger. The Phalanx Block 1B is built around the M61A1 Vulcan cannon, the same rotary barrel weapon used in the FCA-18 Super Hornet. 6 barrels, hydraulic drive. It reaches full firing speed in roughly half a second. The system is housed in a single self-contained unit. The radar is mounted directly above the gun, the fire control computer is inside the housing, and the entire assembly rotates as one piece. It weighs about 6,000 pounds fully loaded. It requires no external power other than the ship's standard supply. On an Arleigh Burke class destroyer, the system is typically installed on the starboard side aft and the port side forward, giving overlapping coverage arcs across the ship's most exposed quadrants. The Block 1B variant adds a surface search mode, meaning the system can also engage small surface contacts like fast attack boats, and an updated electro-optical sensor for passive tracking. That upgrade matters in places like the Strait of Hormuz, where urgy fast boats operate in cluttered coastal radar returns. But the core function has not changed in 45 years. Find the incoming threat, track it continuously, and put enough tungsten rounds into its path that it ceases to exist before it reaches the hull. What has changed is the nature of the threat. The Phalanx was designed for Soviet missiles traveling at Mach 0.8 to Mach 2. Fast, dense, expensive, arriving one or two at a time, usually from a known bearing. That threat profile shaped every parameter of the system's design. The engagement envelope, the round count, the fire control logic, all of it was built around stopping a small number of high-speed, high-value inbound objects. What it was not built around was stopping 43 slow-moving Shahed 136 drones arriving simultaneously from 3 different bearings at 40 knots. That gap is where the modern problem lives. The Shahed 136 is an Iranian-designed loitering munition. Its airframe is essentially a delta-wing glider with a small piston engine bolted to the tail. It weighs about 200 kilograms loaded. Its warhead is roughly 50 kilograms of high explosive. Its cruising speed is around 160 kilometers per hour, slower than a highway car. It has a one-way trip range estimated between 1,500 and 2,500 kilometers, depending on configuration and it navigates primarily by GPS with optional inertial backup, not a sophisticated weapon by aerospace standards. Its radar cross-section is small but not negligible. It flies at low altitude, typically between 50 and 100 meters above ground or water, which compresses radar detection time, and it costs roughly $20,000 to $50,000 per unit. That number is the entire strategic logic. One Shahed 136 costs less than a well-equipped pickup truck. The SM-6 interceptor that the Arleigh Burke uses to engage aerial targets at long range costs approximately $4 million per round. The SM-2 Blockgib, the workhorse medium-range interceptor, runs roughly $2 million. Even the evolved Sea Sparrow missile, the shorter range layer between the SM-2 and the Phalanx, costs over $1 million per shot. That is a minimum 40-to-1 cost ratio in the attacker's favor for the cheapest interceptor the ship carries, before you count the Phalanx. This is not an engineering problem, this is an accounting problem. I went through the strike reports from the Red Sea operations in late 2023 and early 2024, when USS Carney and USS Thomas Hudner and other Arleigh Burke destroyers were regularly intercepting Houthi drone and missile launches. One detail kept standing out, not the intercept rates, which were high, but the composition of what was being intercepted. Slow, cheap, subsonic drones making up the majority of the incoming volume, met by interceptors costing 50 to 100 times as much. The math runs the wrong way, and everyone in the chain of command knows it. What's most surprising about how the Phalanx fits into this picture isn't the gun's range limitation, it's how deliberately that limitation was built into the fire control architecture from the beginning, and why that choice actually makes the system more effective, not less, within its design role. Here is why the gun waits. The Phalanx uses what engineers call a closed-loop fire control system, formally described as a track-via missile or, in this case, a track-on-gun architecture. The system's search radar acquires the incoming target and begins generating a track. At the same time, when the gun begins firing, the same radar tracks the outgoing burst of rounds. The fire control computer compares the track of the threat with the track of the rounds in flight, and continuously adjusts the gun's aim to close the gap between them. It is not predicting where the threat will be and firing there. It is watching where its own rounds actually go and walking them onto the target in real time. This is fundamentally different from how a missile works. A missile is fired toward a predicted intercept point, guided by its own seeker or by data link, and it either hits or it doesn't. If it misses, there is no second chance from that round. The Phalanx gun fires a sustained burst, hundreds of rounds per second, and uses the feedback loop of the radar tracking both the outgoing rounds and the incoming threat to correct aim dynamically during the burst. Less like throwing a single dart and more like turning a hose toward a target and adjusting the stream until the water hits. The problem with that method is geometric. For the radar to track both the gun's burst and the incoming target simultaneously with enough resolution to compute a meaningful correction, the angular separation between the two tracks has to be small, and the angular separation is determined by range. At long range, say 5 miles, the physical gap between a burst of rounds and an incoming drone, even if that gap is 100 meters, translates to a very small angle as seen from the ship's radar. The corrections the system can compute are too coarse. The margin of error in the track is larger than the target. The system cannot reliably walk rounds onto the contact. As the target closes, as range decreases from miles to yards, the same physical gap in meters translates to a much larger angle as seen from the tracking radar. The system's resolution improves. The corrections become precise. At roughly 1,500 yards, the geometry reaches the threshold where the closed-loop correction can reliably put rounds on target within a fraction of a second. That is why the gun waits. Not because it cannot spin up earlier, not because it hasn't seen the target, but because before that range, the fire control math does not produce reliable hits. Here is the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. The system is at its most effective at the moment of maximum danger. Firing at 2 miles would burn ammunition against a contact the radar cannot precisely track. Firing at 1,500 yards puts rounds on target with high probability. The weight is the accuracy. Now add the magazine constraint. The Phalanx Block 1B carries 1,550 rounds in its ready drum. At 4,500 rounds per minute, that is roughly 20 seconds of continuous fire. In practice, the system fires in controlled bursts. The engagement against a single target typically consumes somewhere between 200 and 500 rounds depending on target size, speed, and aspect angle. Against a drone the size of a Shahed 136, a burst of perhaps 300 rounds represents one contact engaged. That leaves the math visible. 1,550 rounds divided by 300 rounds per engagement gives roughly 5 engagements before the magazine is dry. 5. Against a coordinated healthy strike package of a dozen or more Shahed 136s arriving in overlapping waves, 5 engagements from the Phalanx means the gun is empty before the raid is half over. And reloading a Phalanx at sea is not a quick evolution. The magazine drum is a preloaded unit that requires handling equipment and personnel time. In an active engagement, reloading mid-raid is functionally not an option. Put yourself in the combat information center of that destroyer for a moment. Radar shows 15 inbound contacts. The SM-6 and SM-2 magazines are not unlimited, and Arleigh Burke carries 96 Mk-41 vertical launch system cells shared across all its missile types: Tomahawks, SM-2s, SM-6s, SM quad packs, anti-submarine rockets. Every cell that holds a surface-to-air missile is one that doesn't hold something else, and every missile fired is a cell that goes dark. The evolved Sea Sparrow in quad-pack configuration gives the ship additional short-range shots, but still at a cost per engagement that dwarfs the threat it intercepts. So the captain is making a calculation in real time. Spend the expensive mid-range interceptors early to reduce the raid before it gets close, knowing each shot costs $2 to $4 million against a $50,000 drone. Or hold the SM-2s and let the Phalanx take the first wave, knowing the gun has roughly 5 shots before it's dry. And here is the layer underneath that decision. The Phalanx firing its 20 seconds does not guarantee a kill. Against a traditional sea-skimming anti-ship missile, the system's original design, target, intercept probability per engagement is estimated in the range of 70 to 80% in controlled testing. Against a slow, small drone with a low radar cross-section flying an irregular approach path, that number is less certain. The geometry helps. Slow targets spend more time inside the engagement window. But the radar cross-section of a Shahed 136 is small enough that track continuity can degrade. The closed-loop correction only works if the radar maintains a solid track on both the incoming contact and the outgoing burst simultaneously. Lose track for even a fraction of a second, and the correction breaks. The gun may fire. It may burn 300 rounds, and the drone may still arrive. The Houthi operations in the Red Sea in 2023 and 2024 produced at least several instances where inbound contacts penetrated to ranges where the Phalanx should have engaged, but damage still occurred. Not because the system failed, but because the raid geometry and volume overwhelmed the engagement sequencing. When 15 contacts arrive from different bearings in overlapping time windows, the Phalanx can only point in one direction at a time. Contacts approaching from the port quarter, while the gun is engaged to starboard, simply have no coverage until the gun repositions. The RAM, Rolling Airframe Missile, is the system designed to complement the Phalanx in exactly this scenario. The Mk-49 RAM launcher, which some Arleigh Burke variants carry, fires a heat-seeking missile with a range of roughly 9 kilometers, providing a bridge layer between the SM and the Phalanx. Against slow, heat-emitting targets like propeller-driven drones, the RAM's infrared seeker is an effective tracker. But not all Arleigh Burke destroyers carry the RAM launcher in their current configuration, and the Mk-49 magazine holds 21 rounds against a large raid. That capacity runs out quickly as well. Here is what this costs in dollars. The Phalanx CIWS unit itself, in Block 1B configuration, costs roughly $6 to $8 million per mount. A standard Arleigh Burke destroyer carries 2 mounts, $12 to $16 million in close-in defense hardware per hull. The ship itself costs approximately $2 billion. The Phalanx rounds, the 20mm tungsten penetrators in their aluminum sabots, run roughly $30 each in bulk procurement. A full magazine of 1,550 rounds costs about $47,000. The gun's ammunition is, ironically, the cheapest consumable on the ship. The SM-6, the outer layer interceptor, is currently priced at approximately $4 million per round in recent procurement contracts. The SM-2 block IIB runs roughly $2 million. The SM Block 2 is around $1.3 million per missile. An Arleigh Burke with a full load of surface-to-air missiles, a theoretical mix of SM-2, SM-6, and SM, carries a magazine value in the hundreds of millions of dollars, sitting in cells that cost nothing to fire but everything to replace. Here's the take that'll probably get some pushback. The current layered defense architecture aboard an Arleigh Burke is optimized for a threat environment that no longer represents the primary danger. The entire cost structure, multi-million-dollar interceptors covering the outer layers, a cheap gun at the close-in layer, was designed for a world where the incoming threat was expensive and rare. A Soviet cruise missile worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, fired by a submarine that spent months in position. Spending $2 million to stop a $200,000 missile was a reasonable trade. Spending $2 million to stop a $50,000 Shahed 136, one of 40 launched that afternoon, is a different calculation entirely, and the system was not designed for it. Navy planners and acquisition officers are not unaware of this. The push for directed energy systems, high-powered lasers, and high-power microwave weapons is directly driven by the cost per shot problem. A laser engagement costs roughly a few dollars in electricity. Against a drone raid of 50 contacts, the economic math inverts entirely. The USS Preble tested the high-energy laser with integrated optical dazzler and surveillance system, called Helios, in 2022 surface warfare trials. The Navy's solid-state laser technology maturation program has been pushing toward shipboard installation, but as of the mid-2020s, none of these systems are operational on deployed surface combatants at a power level sufficient for reliable drone intercept in contested environments. The Phalanx is what exists, and what exists costs $30 a round, has 20 seconds of firing time, and waits until 1,500 yards. Now close the loop on the paradox. The gun holds fire not because of doctrine or caution or any administrative rule. It holds fire because before 1,500 yards, the fire control physics do not produce reliable hits. The closed-loop track-on gun system, the architecture that makes the Phalanx the most reliable last-ditch defense in the US Navy's surface warfare inventory, requires the target to be close enough that the radar can distinguish between the outgoing burst and the incoming contact at sufficient resolution to compute real-time corrections. That resolution threshold is approximately 1,500 yards for the targets and radar frequencies involved. Everything before that range is the job of other systems. The Aegis combat system aboard the Arleigh Burke uses the AN-SPY-1D phased RA radar, or the SPY-6 in the Flight 3 variants, to track contacts from well beyond the horizon. At 90+ miles, the SM-2 engages. At 70+ miles, the SM-6 can reach. Inside 30 miles, the SM takes layered shots, and inside 9 kilometers, if the ship carries RAM, the rolling airframe missile fires. The Phalanx is not a weapon that replaces those layers. It is the layer that catches what all of them missed. The detail that stuck with me after going through the technical documentation. The Phalanx's 20-second magazine is calculated almost exactly for the time a target spends inside that 1,500-yard engagement window, traveling at the speed of a typical anti-ship missile. A Mach 0.8 sea skimmer covers 1,500 yards in roughly 3 seconds. The system has time for 1 to 2 bursts per contact, and the magazine supports multiple such engagements before running dry. Against the design threat, the magazine depth is almost precisely calibrated to the engagement geometry. Against a Shahed 136 traveling at 40 knots, roughly 65 feet per second, the same 1,500 yards takes about 70 seconds to cover. The target spends 20 times as long in the engagement window. The gun has time for multiple burst attempts per contact. In one sense, a slow drone is easier to track and engage than a fast missile. In another sense, 20 slow drones arriving simultaneously each consume time in that window, serializing the engagements in a way the system cannot parallelize. The obstacle the Phalanx faces against a drone swarm is not the individual engagement, it is the queue. 15 contacts inside 1,500 yards simultaneously means 15 targets competing for one gun. The system engages them sequentially, acquiring, tracking, firing, evaluating, moving to the next. At the speed the gun repositions between contacts, even with fast slew rates, simultaneous multiple inbounds from different bearings create gaps in coverage. The math is unambiguous. Enough contacts arriving at the same time from enough different angles will saturate the engagement sequencing before the gun can clear them all. That saturation is not a malfunction, it is a physics limit. The human cost of that limit is not abstract. In May 2021, The Israeli Navy's Sa'ar 6 class corvette Ines Eilat, equipped with a Phalanx equivalent close-in system, faced a salvo of Hamas rockets over the Mediterranean. The system engaged and cleared the threat. No casualties. In October 2023, a drone strike attributed to Iranian-backed forces struck the tanker Central Park in the Red Sea, injuring crew members. The Central Park was a commercial vessel with no close-in defense system. In November 2023, the container ship CMA-CGM Simi was struck by a Houthi missile. In February 2024, the bulk carrier Rubamar was hit and eventually sank. The first confirmed vessel sunk by Houthi action. None of these were U.S. Navy warships. The Navy's Phalanx-equipped destroyers in the region intercepted the threats aimed at them. But the crew of an Arleigh Burke in the Red Sea knows a specific arithmetic. The ship has 96 VLS cells. After a week of sustained operations intercepting Houthi drone and missile launches, some of those cells are empty. Resupply at sea for VLS weapons is not currently operationally feasible. Missiles have to come from a port, which means transiting to a resupply point, which means time off station, which means gaps in coverage. The USS Carney, which intercepted multiple Houthi salvos in the Red Sea in late 2023, expended a significant portion of its SM-2 and SM-6 inventory during sustained operations. The question of how to reload a Burke at sea without interrupting station is one that Navy logistics planners do not have a clean answer to. The commanding officer of a destroyer in an active threat environment makes a decision with every intercept. Spend the expensive round now, at long range with high confidence, and accept the magazine attrition, or hold the round, accept the risk that the threat gets closer, and trust the cheaper layers to catch it. There is no correct answer. There is only a trade-off, and every trade-off has a cost, either in dollars or in probability of a hit getting through. What this tells us about the current state of surface warfare is uncomfortable. The layered defense architecture the US Navy has built over 40 years is structurally expensive in a way that a cheap drone threat is specifically designed to exploit. Not because anyone designed it wrong, but because the optimization was rational for the threat that existed when the design was fixed. The world changed faster than the procurement cycle. The response to this problem is moving on several tracks simultaneously. The Navy's distributed lethality concept pushes more capable weapons onto more hulls, spreading the intercept burden across a larger force rather than concentrating it on individual destroyers. The San Antonio-class amphibious ships and the Constellation-class frigates, currently under construction, will carry their own close-in and short-range defense systems. The frigate program specifically is intended to restore numbers to a surface fleet that has shrunk in hull count even as individual ship capability has grown. The directed energy track, as mentioned, aims to eliminate the cost per shot problem entirely. Helios and its successors, if they mature to operational reliability, change the economics of a drone raid from the attacker's favor to the defender's. But if they mature is doing a lot of work in that sentence. High-energy laser systems face persistent engineering challenges in the maritime environment. Salt spray degrades optics, atmospheric turbulence scatters the beam, and thermal management in a shipboard installation is substantially harder than in a ground-based or airborne platform. The programs have been running for over a decade without a deployed operational system on a surface combatant. The interim answer, the one that exists today, deployed right now in the Red Sea and the Gulf, is the Phalanx doing what it was designed to do, within an engagement envelope it was designed for against a threat it was not designed for. Will directed energy systems solve the cost per shot problem before adversaries fully exploit the gap? Comment yes or no. We're genuinely tracking how this plays out, and the answer affects every surface warfare program currently in procurement. The gun waits at 1,500 yards. That weight is not failure. It is the consequence of choosing a fire control method that trades range for precision and precision for reliability. Against the threat it was designed for, it is one of the most reliable last-ditch defense systems ever put on a ship. Against a 50-drone raid, it is 5 engagements, 20 seconds, and an empty magazine. The commanding officer makes the call. The decision tree runs like this. Incoming raid is detected at 70 miles. Aegis assigns the contacts. SM-6 engages the highest threat contacts, the ones that look like anti-ship missiles, the ones with radar signatures and speeds consistent with something that will kill the ship if it arrives. At $4 million per shot, those rounds are spent carefully. SM-2 engages the mid-tier contacts as the raid closes. SM takes the fast movers that break through inside 30 miles. And somewhere around 3 miles, the remaining contacts, the ones that slip through, the ones that the missile layers couldn't queue in time, the ones that came from the blind bearing, those are what the Phalanx sees. The gun spins up at 1,500 yards. If there are 3 contacts remaining, the magazine handles it. If there are 12, the gun fires its 20 seconds and goes empty, and the contacts inside 1,500 yards that weren't engaged arrive at the hull. That is not a prediction. That is arithmetic. The captain who burns SM-6 rounds early at long range against drone contacts keeps the inner layers cleaner but depletes the magazine that was supposed to handle the next salvo. The captain who holds the expensive rounds and trusts the Phalanx saves missiles for the second wave but accepts higher risk that the first wave reaches the hull. Neither choice is wrong. Both choices have a price. Here's what rarely gets discussed in the public framing of naval air defense. The decision to hold fire with expensive missiles is not timidity, it is inventory management. A destroyer that fires every SM-6 in its cells, stopping 50 Shahed 136s, is a destroyer that has no SM-6s left when an actual KH-35 anti-ship missile comes off an Iranian frigate an hour later. The captain who held fire and accepted 3 drone hits on the superstructure, painful, costly, possibly injurious, may have preserved the ship's ability to stop the weapon that would have sunk it. That calculus does not appear in the headline about the drone strike, but it lives in the combat log. There is a white dome on the deck of every Arleigh Burke class destroyer. It has not changed substantially in 45 years. It sits silent as threats are handled by systems with ranges measured in miles, by missiles that cost more than the annual budget of a small city, by a combat management system running on software that fills rooms of servers below the waterline. And then inside 1,500 yards, it moves. 20 seconds, 1,550 rounds. A closed-loop radar walking tungsten onto an incoming contact at the edge of the ship's survival envelope. The short range is not a weakness. The short range is the physics of making it work. But here is the question that does not resolve neatly. If the cheapest layer on the ship has the smallest window, and the cheapest threat in the adversary's arsenal is specifically designed to arrive in numbers that saturate that window, does the architecture hold? Does a captain who has burned through half a VLS magazine stopping drones over 3 days of Red Sea operations still have enough left to stop the weapon that actually matters when it comes? There's a piece of this story we didn't fully work through here, specifically how the Navy is thinking about the VLS reload problem and whether the Constellation-class frigate changes the distributed intercept math. If you want that breakdown, drop a comment and we'll run it. The Phalanx waits at 1,500 yards. The captain chooses which round to spend and which to hold. The drone keeps coming. And the math, as always, does not negotiate.